Hello, everyone. We are going to go ahead and begin this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to the webinar today. My name is Emily Cohen, and I am the Program and Learning Coordinator here at Faith Trust Institute. And I'm here to welcome you to this webinar on Safe Congregations and Risk Reduction, a starter kit. I will introduce our presenter, Reverend Dr. Sarah Rees, in just a moment, but first I just want to go over a few things regarding our time together today. If you're having any technical problems, you can find my name in the drop-down menu of the chat box, which you should see on the right side of your screen. And if you just send me a message with what you're experiencing, I can help you troubleshoot that once we get started. Reverend Dr. Rees is looking forward to hearing from you during our 1 hour together, so please do utilize both the Q&A box and the chat box to send in questions. We're going to be reserving the last about 15 minutes of our time to address those questions, but do feel free to send them in at any point along the way as you think of them, and then I'll hold on to them until the designated time. Just a note about that, the Q&A box that you see on the right side of your screen is public, so whatever you're typing in there, it'll be sent to all of us who are online today. And the chat box, you can designate who your recipient is. So if you'd like to use the chat box to send me a direct question, then that'll just be between the two of us. Thirdly, these slides that you will see on your screen today will be emailed to you later this afternoon so that you can refer back to the information and resources after we conclude today. And if any additional resources come up during the conversation, I'll be sure to add those to the PowerPoint as well. Lastly, I just want to mention that we are recording this webinar to make it available on our website for those who can't join for the live session. So welcome to any of those who are listening to the recording. Next, I want to take a moment to say a little bit about this webinar. It is a part of a series of 12 webinars sponsored by the Lutheran Community Foundation in 2013 as part of their Ending Family Violence initiative. The LCF is committed to providing tools and resources to faith leaders and congregations to address issues surrounding domestic violence. So we're really glad that we can offer these webinars to all of you at no cost because of their sponsorship. So please take a look at the lcf.org and you can read more about the good work that they're doing. So thank you to the Lutheran Community Foundation. And that is all from me. I am pleased to welcome Reverend Dr. Sarah Rees. Reverend Dr. Rees is an Episcopal priest serving as a pastoral psychotherapist and consultant in independent practice in Charlotte, North Carolina. A diplomate in the American Association of Pastoral Counselors, she works with many survivors of childhood abuse and domestic violence. Her dissertation and published articles focus on the healing needs of survivors of abuse. She's worked with her own and other judicatories to develop policies, procedures, prevention training, healing protocols, and pastoral response teams to address misconduct in the church, and she has provided many healing consultations for churches of several denominations. So we're really pleased to welcome you, Reverend Dr. Rees, and I will go ahead and pass it over to you to begin our presentation today.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, each and every one of you, for attending this webinar today and giving part of your day to focus on this very important matter of how we can make our congregations safe for all people at all times. In the title of the webinar, we have risk reduction, and of course that sounds like it's an insurance industry-driven kind of phrase, and in some ways that's really true. What we have long hoped for is that the church would be able and willing to develop safety practices in their congregations without trauma and tragedy having to force the issue. But unfortunately, that is exactly what has happened. And so what we are about today is to talk about best practices in making your congregation safe, both because it's the right thing to do and because we love all of God's people and want everyone to be safe at all times, and also to comply with the new standards of practice and emerging standards of best practices in terms of reducing risk in our congregations. I think that you would not be attending this webinar if you didn't know that. Can we have the next slide, please? Emily, thank you. You wouldn't be attending the webinar if you didn't know that there was some urgency in this matter, perhaps in your own congregation or your regional or larger denominational judicatory to protect children and vulnerable adults. And so what we want to focus on today is how to address the real risks of child abuse in the church's facilities and programs, and to develop practical plans to reduce them. I want to suggest some guidelines for responding to disclosures of abuse, and also to offer some beginning information on how you can begin to develop policies and procedures in your own congregations and judicatories. Next slide, please. You see at the bottom of that slide that God has had to use the insurance industry and legal actions to get churches to do the right thing. I said something about that a moment ago. That's actually a quote from a man who served on the first policy and procedures task force that I served on and chaired, and it was this stunning awareness on his part that, oh my gosh, we really have not been doing the right thing. And so it did seem to him that God has had to use these entities, the insurance industry and legal industry, to get churches to follow, since we had failed to lead. It's interesting that I've been listening today, and I'm sure that you have as well, to reports about the terrible tornado and destruction in Moore, Oklahoma, and I've been quite taken with the issue that the 2 elementary schools in the region that did not have storm shelters were not prepared for a tornado, even though 36 people had been killed in a tornado in May of 1999 in that very area. What was it in the lives of the people who were building new schools and new additions to schools that they chose to, was it save money? What was it that caused them not to have a storm shelter in those schools? We put surge protectors on our computers and our electronic equipment in our homes and offices. That's what we're talking about here, is having surge protectors. And so why don't we do what we must do? There's the head in the sand approach. I don't want to know. I don't want to know about it. And that can come from just an intellectual refusal to focus on this. It can come from long ago deep denied or dissociated wounds in a person's life that they don't want to face, cannot bear to address in their own lives, much less in an institution. The attitude that it doesn't happen in my church, a very risky attitude. It's kind of like the schools in Moore, Oklahoma. It won't happen here again. We do know that child sexual abuse happens in churches and synagogues and religious bodies of every faith. And just because we're good people does not protect us from abuse happening. In fact, what we know is that sexual predators with children are going to go to places where there are children. They're not going to go to a place where there are not children. And so that in its very self heightens the risk of abuse happening in my church. And then many people don't want to address this issue because it's costly to do background checks and to engage in a process of interviewing and reference checking and all of that. I'd like to invite you at this moment to join in the chat box and let us know what some of your experiences have been about this. What any of these 3 that are listed in the bullets, resistances that you've experienced in your own congregations, or what other resistances might you have encountered as you've begun to address these issues in your church life.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so feel free to either answer the poll that should be showing you on the right side of your screen by clicking A, B, or C, or you can also send in any further comments you have about the issue using the chat box. So far, I can see people answering the question. There's about 15% who are saying that their community is taking the head in the sand approach, and it looks like that number is rapidly climbing. People are filling in their answers, and then about 10% each in terms of doesn't happen in my church or too expensive. So it looks like the majority of people online with us today are taking or experiencing the head in the sand approach in their communities.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Emily, and thank you everybody for joining in that way. So if you are someone in your congregation who is a lay leader, a clergy member, president of the council, a youth worker, someone who has a passion about this as a lay person in any role in the life of the church, you have your work cut out for you if the head in the sand approach or any one of these other resistances is manifesting. And it's hard work because people, especially if there's the head in the sand approach, will want to vilify you and scapegoat you for raising these difficult issues. But these excuses do not justify doing nothing, and the excuses don't justify not doing an adequate job of safeguarding God's children.
Sarah, there's a comment coming in on the chat on this topic as well, saying someone mentioning that they do talk about it in their community and realize that it's an issue, but they just haven't quite done anything yet about it, taking the next step towards action. So.
Wonderful. Thank you for saying that. I'm glad that your congregation is already in motion in beginning to address this, and I hope that this webinar and perhaps Faith Trust Institute as a resource after the webinar can be of support to you as you begin to take the next steps. I hope that you will, and I hope that you and others won't let it drop. Next slide, please. I want to move through what is a foundational understanding for how it is that we must address the issue of child abuse in the church. And that comes down to power and vulnerability. Each one of us, no matter our circumstances, has attributes of power, and those same attributes might be an attribute of vulnerability as well. Our race, gender, mental health, economic class, physical health, physical ability, sexual orientation. All of these are attributes of power and also can be an attribute of vulnerability at the same time. Next slide, please. I believe that power is morally neutral and can be used for great good and also can be used for harm. Everyone carries various vulnerabilities as I said, as well as attributes of power. And it is true that children have less power and more vulnerabilities than we adults do. Even if a child is the prettiest girl or the beauty pageant winner or the guy who is the star on the basketball team or the best scholar in the class, those are all attributes of power that young people would have. But in the presence of adults, because of age difference, size differential, intellectual differential, their need for us as adults for affection and to feel special, their desire to please, they need for us to care for their needs, whatever our role is for them. They're also vulnerable because of less of an access to resources, for example, to get away from abusive conduct. So they have more vulnerability than adults do. We have the responsibility as adults to use our own attributes of power, whether it's those that I named earlier or the power and authority in our role within the life of an institution, a family, to care for and to protect children. How does sexual abuse happen? It's when a person who has more power uses sexual means to satisfy his or her own needs for power, control, and sexual gratification at the expense of the person who is more vulnerable and has less power in the relationship. I want to say something more for a moment about adults' vulnerabilities. Our own personal history, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the head in the sand approach, that approach can come out of some kind of wounding in one's personal history. But at any given moment, we could also have health worries, we could have financial problems, insecurity. Is our job going to be secure next month? All of those are true. We carry the mixture of our power and our vulnerabilities at the same time, at all times. No matter how vulnerable we feel, no matter how powerless we feel as adults, it is always imperative that we exercise our fiduciary responsibility to act in the best interest of a child's needs. Next slide, please. This is a summary, really, of the bullet points that will show up in the next couple of slides. The summary being, do no harm and protect the vulnerable. And the phrase, do no harm, also means do not allow harm to be caused. In my work with survivors of abuse through the years, what I have learned is that it is often the bystander or bystanders. It could be the non-abusing parent. It could be the people in the church school who knew that the youth minister was sexually molesting the teenagers, but stood by because he was a nice guy, or he was the son of the senior minister, or whatever. That's standing by and allowing harm to be caused, and that survivors have taught me that often the deepest injury has come from that sense of betrayal they've experienced from those who have stood by and allowed the harm to be caused. Next slide, please. I'm not going to read these to you, but I have highlighted a couple of these ethical principles for your perusal, and would ask that after the webinar you'd also read and consider the rest of the bullet points. Having to do with what I've just been speaking about, protecting and honoring another person's vulnerabilities. Important to do the greatest good rather than what we think is convenient for us. Next slide, please. Same thing, a couple of these being highlighted. I wanted to highlight F, the role of church leaders is to encourage discipleship, community, and interdependence rather than secret relationships and inappropriate dependency, because that is one of the ways that sexual offenders with children prey upon them by creating a secret relationship and an inappropriate dependency as part of the grooming process. And then, of course, what we're trying to address in this webinar is that there is a need for accountability at all levels in the church. Accountability is not the same thing as forgiveness. I'd love to be able to address that in a whole webinar in and of itself. Meanwhile, let's move on to the next slide, please. And so we have strategies that have become industry standard, and by industry I mean across secular and religious organizations that work with children. These are best practices, standards of practice that are absolutely essential in our work with children. First, of course, that no accused or convicted sex offender should be involved with children. If your congregation has an accused or convicted sex offender, that person should be accompanied at all times. There is a recorded webinar, which we'll mention at the end of this webinar, that you can access for free at the Faith Trust Institute webinar, listing of webinars, and I believe there's going to be another one coming up live. It may be next month or in 2 months, I can't remember. So you might want to participate in that, or at least listen to the recorded one, in terms of how you will address the issue of the presence of a sex offender in your congregation. The 6-month rule, another best practice, meaning that churches who have people working with children, youth, and teens do not allow someone who is new to the congregation just to jump right in and begin to work with them. We want to get to know a new member of the church. Just because someone seems like a really nice person and has got a lot of experience, and of course we just want to scoop them right up and get them to work with the 7th grade Sunday school class because no one else wants to work with that age group. That is a vulnerability that the church would have, is, oh, well, you're perfect for this. We've been praying for someone to come in, but no, the 6-month rule means we take time to get to know all of our new members before we allow anyone to enter the process of becoming an approved adult to work with children in the life of the church. The 2-adult rule is another standard of practice, meaning that there be 2 adults with every group of children, and when there's a larger group, that there be 1 adult for every 5 youth. This is just a sensible thing to do, besides being a best practice. If a kid falls down and is injured and 911 has to be called, or a kid starts throwing up and someone's got to leave to go get a nurse, or, there's 450 permutations of that, why we need to have at least 2 adults present. The next couple of bullet points have to do with the line of sight and visibility of people who are working with children, being present with children and youth in our churches, to keep your doors open whenever possible, although it is important when there needs to truly be a confidential, quiet conversation with a child or youth, that the doors would be closed, but someone else needs to know that you are meeting with that person and where, and of course to be sensible about doing that at business times of the day and not at 8:30 at night and so forth, and not in far off, secluded places in the church. Closed doors should have windows in them. Having a sign-in, sign-out process for children who are in the program, the Christian education program, is an important safety practice, that you would only allow the children to be handed over to a parent or guardian. Some churches have quite extensive process for that to really make it leak-proof, and that's all to the good. There should be no corporal punishment or spanking or humiliation or verbal abuse, and of course that's something that needs to be in your policy and procedures. There would be a criminal and possibly civil background check on all of your staff and volunteers. And another best practice is that you would have anyone who is applying to be an approved adult in your congregation to go through prevention training that includes recognizing signs of abuse in a child, how do you respond, how do you report, and how sex offenders engage children in order for them to offend. One standard theory on that is by David Finkelhor, a prominent sociologist who has developed what he calls his 4-factor theory. And of course, including a component like that in a prevention training completely goes against people who want to maintain the head in the sand approach, because why would we want to know how it happens? What are the factors that need to be present for abuse to take place? But in fact, it's really essential that we do understand how sexual predators, sex offenders with children engage the child's trust and the parent's trust and the church's trust through these 4 factors, so that we can be wise as serpents and gentle as doves as we address this. Next slide, please.
Sarah, if I could jump in just really quickly.
Sure.
If you could just adjust your microphone just a tad. The volume is excellent, but it sounds like you might be a little bit close to your microphone. If you could just move it a little bit further away from me, I think that would help a little bit. There's a tiny bit of feedback, but we can hear you just fine.
Okay. Emily, you know me. I'm having trouble. I'm going to be under.
You're using a headset?
No.
A microphone? Just connected to your computer. If you could just maybe just back away a few inches, that's all we need from wherever the source of your microphone is.
Okay. I will try that.
Okay, no problem.
Is this any better?
I can't tell yet, but just go ahead and proceed. It's not a major issue, but it sounds like you might have just been a little bit close for a minute there.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Thanks. Policies, procedures, and background checks. Why is it necessary that we have a policy and procedures? Why is it necessary that we do background checks? In addition to the ethical mandate, which I've addressed briefly earlier in the webinar, we know that churches have legally been found liable for negligent hiring, negligent supervision, and negligent retention of someone who has caused injury and harm. Churches have also been found legally liable for having a policy and procedures but not following it. So, for example, I've known quite a number of situations where churches have kind of developed a policy and procedures and then, dusted their hands of the whole matter, and then when there's a situation that occurs, the person in charge decides to go his or her own way and avoid the policy and procedures, and the accuser's attorney is going to be all over that, like as we say here in the South, it's like white on rice. They're going to be all over it. Oh, you had a policy and procedures and you didn't follow them? So to think about how a jury pool would think, did you do all that you could to protect children? Oh, well, no, you didn't do a background check. Oh, you didn't check references. You didn't have a formal application. You thought, well, the person who has worked with 7th graders before would be the perfect person to come in and start right up in your church. So, no, you haven't done all that you could to protect children, and that's when the big money settlements come out. You want to develop a policy and procedures that will include, but is not limited to, issues about how you will hire and engage, recruit volunteers, so hire staff and recruit volunteers, how you will report, reporting of accusations will take place in your church, how you will respond, how you will minister to all the parties, and how you will retain records. Reference checks, important to get at least 3 reference checks, and not from a friend in the congregation, preferably from a previous volunteer supervisor or employment supervisor. And you're going to be wary of someone who's got lots of jobs that lasted a short amount of time in working with youth. You want to conduct interviews with everyone from whom you have received an application form, and begun to do reference checks on. And then to have criminal and civil reference checks done from an approved agency. Now, head in the sand doesn't happen in my church. Too expensive. All usually come up around this matter of background checks. The big cases that have happened in the past have happened in part because background checks were not done and clergy and youth workers were passed from one place to another. So it's just not a safe thing not to engage in doing background checks. Some churches have begun to designate persons who have gone through all of this, whether it's as a volunteer or as a staff member, as an approved adult. And the designation of approved adult includes both a letter of acceptance as being designated as an approved adult, and then a list that's disseminated in the congregation. These are our approved adults. And so again, these are people who have gone through the application, the reference checks, the interviews, the background checks, the prevention training, and have been signed off on us. These are our approved adults. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier that when there is a perpetrator in your congregation, or even accused person, that's something that must be addressed in the church's policy and procedures. And we have two resources that are named at the end of this webinar, which we'll talk about in a few moments. Next slide, please. The moment of, oh my God, I really hope this never happens, happens, and a child comes to you, a youth says, my father, the minister, the whomever, mom's new boyfriend abused me and this is what he or she did. The most important thing that you can do is to stay calm, even if you feel like you are freaking out inside. So this is where working with response teams and having opportunities for team members in your local congregation or your diocese or synod or region to get together to do practice sessions and role-playing scenarios so that when the moment comes that a child does disclose, you will know that you can stay calm and that you'll know some things to say. You do not want to get involved in investigating at all. Please avoid getting involved in investigating what the child is saying, but stay present and loving and pastoral with the child. I'm so sorry that this has happened to you. I'm so glad you told me you did the right thing in telling me. And it's important that the child knows that you believe that, because most abusers will coerce a child into silence and secrecy with some kind of threat. And so for them to know that you affirm that they broke that silence and broke that bond, that trauma bond with the abuser is essential. Of course, you won't use that language, but you did the right thing. Thank you for telling me. And then let's talk about what we can do to make it stop. Next slide, please. And this is one of the things that you will do to help make it stop, is making a report to the authorities. If you're a clergy member, depending on your state, you might be mandated legally to report child sexual abuse. And by the way, reporting is of a reasonable suspicion of abuse. You do not have to know for sure. You don't need documentation. You don't need a written affidavit. You're going to not get involved in that, but just a reasonable person would have reason to suspect that abuse is taking place. So know your state laws, whether you're a clergy person or not, but even if you are not legally mandated, morally, every person is mandated to make a report of suspected child abuse. Then in your system, say it's you're working with in the Christian education program at the church, who in the system is charged with making a report? Again, it could you are mandated morally to do it, but there may be someone in your system, perhaps it's the church school superintendent, the head of youth ministry, the assistant minister, the senior pastor, the president of the congregation. Track it if you turn the report over to someone else in the system, so that make sure that that report has actually been made, because if it hasn't been, then you've got to go back behind that and make a report. Anyone is mandated plus you, and as I said earlier, do not get involved in investigating. That is the role of these state and local systems. When you don't know quite what you should do, call your local or state Child Protective Services agency. The phone numbers are online. They're in the front of phone books, if you have one anymore. How do you do it? How do you make a report? First, you make notes about the situation. You call the hotline number. You make the notes about the call. You make the phone numbers available in your church or institutional policies and training materials. When you have any doubt, make the report. Observe the boundaries of confidentiality. There's no expiration date on that, so if you're the president of the congregation and you're the one who is charged to make the report, you don't, once the family has moved out of the area, start passing the word around, ever. These are, on this slide, the entities that can give you information about what to do, or do you think I should make this report? I mean, they will give you information about, does this constitute abuse, what this child is reporting? They want to be there to help you. It's a scary and a lonely and an upsetting thing to do, and so make sure that you have appropriate yet confidential support for yourself. The great former Dominican priest Matthew Fox said that fear is not a reason not to act with courage. There's more information about how to make a report of suspected child abuse in a mandatory reporting webinar on the Faith Trust Institute website that was offered on March 6th of 2013. Next slide, please. Components of a policy and procedures document, and this is really, it needs to be a whole nother webinar. We can't really get into all of the components, and this is also where Faith Trust Institute can serve as a resource in helping guide you around developing your own policy and procedures. But there needs to be a statement clearly stating what constitutes unethical and abusive conduct. Who are the persons who will receive the initial complaint? Make sure that the insurance carrier for the congregation is notified immediately of the allegation and the complaint. Designate in advance who is going to be the designated hitter to report the alleged abuse. Again, tracking that so that if the person has the head in the sand approach and wants to go off policy, that you still are the one, since the child has disclosed to you, you are still the one who can report and will. And then, as I said earlier, having a strategy in the document on what to do when a perpetrator or accused person is in your church. Again, that's one of those things where we think it's not going to happen, but I've worked with a number of sex offenders who, even though they are forbidden from being within a certain distance of children, they still will come into a church, and it raises a lot of important theological issues about sin and forgiveness and accountability and so forth, but So there's a brazenness there, and it's important to have that in your policy ahead of time rather than waiting for it to happen and then you're scrambling and getting into the fight of, well, he served his time. No, he's still at risk for abusing children. We shouldn't take it. So you don't want to get into that at the moment that it's happening. Again, your policy and procedures document needs to include issues about hiring and recruiting of volunteers, reporting, responding, administering, retention of records. And could we have the next slide, please, Emily? What follows now are a couple of slides with some kind of checklist matters that you can begin to look at to see where are we, what else do we need to do here. We have a abuse prevention policy. The church governing body has voted it in and reaffirmed it. Some denominations require, or local churches require, each vestry member or council member to sign some document that says, I understand that this is our policy and I will do all in my power to uphold it. In the Episcopal Church, when I was doing this more full-time in my previous diocese, I really wanted in the early 90s and mid-90s for the diocese to refuse to allow a congregation to be admitted to the convention. Would be considered not in good standing if they had not adopted the policy. That was not brought as something that anybody wanted to adopt institutionally in the diocese, but I still think that there need to be consequences for churches other than legal and financial consequences for not having a policy. So big deal if you have a policy unless it's prominently displayed so that people know you have a policy. You don't know who's going to walk in the church and say, oh my gosh, that's happened to my niece. I didn't know the church didn't stand for this. And what are the reporting requirements and policies and procedures? What are our procedures for reducing the risk? Like I talked about, having a prevention program, and of course that all staff and volunteers and lay leaders and workers, the children are informed about the procedures and held accountable for their implementation. So again, it's not just, okay, I attended the 3-hour seminar on this, but I know that I am accountable for making sure that I uphold this in everything that I do and how I engage with my colleagues about these matters. Next slide, please. That your procedure will include application forms, reference checks, interviews for all paid and volunteer workers. As I mentioned before, the background checks, 2 non-related adults present at all times in any church-sponsored class or event involving children. You don't want workers with children who are fewer than 5 years older than the children. No one under the age of 18 unless they are working under the supervision of, at all times, of 2 non-related adults. Windows in the classroom doors, as I mentioned before. Next slide, please. No secluded meetings, bathroom safety practices, advance notice to parents about events that the children are invited to participate in, release of children, mechanisms, safety practices, the 6-month rule or some other written guideline on how long an adult must participate in the church before being allowed to apply to work with children. Generational boundaries for overnights. The policy and procedures about a registered sex offender. All staff and everyone working with children has the information they need to comply with mandatory child abuse reporting laws. And then quickly, I'd like to address just a few other safety practices before we open up the webinar for your questions and comments. Let's think of safety in a holistic way, that all the workers with children are trained in emergency evacuation procedures. Think of the teachers yesterday in Moore, Oklahoma, and what they had to do to protect the children, hiding inside the bathrooms, piling on top of one another to be in the safest place possible. Fire extinguishers strategically located to make sure that you know where they are. First aid kits, CPR, certified adults available at all times. How do you alert people that there's a need for help in the classroom? Floating adults who will be available to resource in case there is an emergency situation. And how do you alert other church leaders so that there's an emergency taking place? And then the next slide, please. We have a carefully monitored system for controlling all the keys to the church property. Boy, it's been my experience with smaller congregations especially that, because, quote unquote, we all trust one another, that everyone's next door neighbor to the congregation, to the brother-in-law can have a key to the property, and it's just really dangerous if you're really trying to be mindful and doing all you can to protect children. The policy that's well publicized on confidentiality, that you carry adequate insurance for everything, exits clearly marked, how you handle and disperse funds, a policy of gift giving between adults and children, policy on electronic communication between clergy and youth workers and parishioners of all ages is a very important other safety practice that we can have another webinar on. And then finally, as we finish up here before your questions, is a list of resources for you. At Personal Risk, a magnificent book that is really an important primer, I think, on how boundary violations in the professional relationship take place by Marilyn Peterson. And I believe that's available through the Faith Trust Institute website. Here are two other events here, the Confidentiality and Mandatory Reporting article by Maurice Fortune, the founder and senior analyst of Faith Trust Institute, the webinar I mentioned earlier, what to do if a registered sex offender comes to your church. Another important article, which is called When the Abuser is Among Us by Carol Adams. That's another resource available through Faith Trust. Once You Cross the Line and Hear Their Cries, both excellent DVDs that have been developed by Faith Trust Institute, and even though they're a number of years old, they're still as fresh as ever in terms of their content and usability for training and understanding of these issues. Faith Trust Institute also can provide, and will be provided for you when the slides are sent to you later this afternoon, a PDF attachment of the Pilgrim United Church of Christ sample policy and procedures. But there are also other resources for you, including your denominational website. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America has very comprehensive set of information and resources. So does the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, and then of course there are many, and you may know of, some local congregation, maybe even another denomination, but one that has a very comprehensive policy and procedures that you might be able to look at to see if that can help you as you develop your own. Just like Pilgrim United Church of Christ, Black Mountain Presbyterian Church in North Carolina has an outstanding policy and procedures, and there are many others as well. You don't have to reinvent the wheel as you develop the policy and procedures. Of course, it might feel like you're doing that, but there are a lot of resources out there that can help you. And now I'd like to open our time together for your questions and comments.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Reese, for the presentation and all the helpful information. There are a few questions here, then we have about 10 minutes left in our time together. And if anyone else has any questions, please do feel free to type them into either the Q&A box or the chat box. There was one just comment that I wanted to name while you were going over the checklist and the safety issues of the issues that arise in small churches and the complications that occur when only a very small group of people are responsible for a large amount of these tasks. And so I just wanted to name that. And I don't know if you had any comments on that, Sarah, but that was a helpful comment that came in.
Yes. Well, it is a very large burden on a small church to address these issues when the personnel, the members of the church are already doing 14 roles, including cleaning the bathrooms and cooking the food and being the treasurer and running the youth department and so forth. This is where, if you're a part of a connectional denomination, it's really good for you to be in touch with other congregations and your denominational authorities and leaders who can help guide you and perhaps even help you partner resource-wise with other congregations, say for education events and so forth. There's no quick formula for addressing this, but just to say yes, it requires ingenuity and creativity and accessing outside resources to help you do the right thing. Being small does not mean abuse is not going to happen in your church, so it's not an excuse not to do the right thing.
Certainly true. Thank you. I'll move on to some of the questions that we have here. There's one question in terms of resources for survivors of child sexual abuse, and once again, we will send out the resource slide, and I'll add a few additional resources that Faith Trust has available. But this person is wondering what resources you may recommend just off the top of your head for individuals who are survivors of child sexual abuse. Do you have any go-to books or other articles or resources that you might recommend to someone in a church setting who may be a lay leader or some individual who is working with survivors?
I have a couple of articles that I can make available that I've written about that.
Okay.
There are, of course, lots of different books out there available on Barnes & Noble and Amazon and at your bookstore and so forth. Some of them can be very helpful, and depending on where a person is on his or her healing journey, can be also quite re-traumatizing. And so, of course, maybe this sounds self-serving for me to say this, but I think that one of the greatest resources is someone in the area with whom the person can talk to steer the person towards the best kind of written materials that will suit where they are developmentally in their healing process. I'm loath to say, well, this book or that book, when it might completely be the wrong thing for that person.
Right, that makes sense. And I'll collect those articles from you, and we can add anything that we choose to the resource slide. So that's good to know about. There's someone here who is working in terms of working with the resistance of their staff, especially around the financial issues, and their staff people are concerned around the cost that you spoke to a little bit about when it comes to background checks and other procedures. Could you just extrapolate a little bit more on this and maybe speak to the larger issues of spending money before versus after?
Well, go back to Moore, Oklahoma. I mean, was it cost effective? And what are we talking about in terms of cost for those schools that didn't have the shelter provision? What's the cost of a human life? The same thing goes for children who are abused. A life is changed forever. I'm involved in a healing ministry, and I know that healing happens, but it is a lifelong journey to come out of the trauma and devastation that happens when a trusted adult abuses a child. So spend now or spend a lot more later, to put it bluntly. Again, think of what's the jury pool going to say once you are sued for abuse happening in your church. Not to mention the devastation when the news media come around and there's the board outside the church that announces the time of services, and that's the church that allows children to be abused. That actually happened with a church that I know of in another city. So the staff resistance is, it's hard to think of it this way when we want to trust one another and we want to be conservative with our financial resources. But what is the jury pool going to say if and when there's an allegation? Are they going to say, you did do everything possible? They're going to say, it is the standard of practice with the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, Big Brother, Big Sister, and denominations, any organization working with children, that you have background checks. Furthermore, there are some background check processes that are not very expensive at all. I know that the Evangelical Church, Lutheran Church in America website provides some information about that. And so do not hesitate to contact attorneys and other resources in your area who would know about this. Attorneys for your denomination or other officials in your denomination. A child abuse prevention ombudsperson is a role that I know the Presbyterian Church USA has. There are resources out there that can steer you towards more affordable background check processes. But not to do it is putting yourselves at tremendous risk.
Thank you. And there's a question here on a specific resource in terms of training for all people who work with children and youth. Do you know, or can you speak anything about the Stewards of Children training, which is brought by Darkness to Light?
I don't know that resource. What denomination?
It's from the organization Darkness to Light, and I can send you some information on that and also include it in the resource slide. I cannot speak to it myself, but I know that it's a resource and a developed training program. So I'll include that information so people can access that later.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to know about a new resource.
Yeah, that is always helpful. We just have a couple minutes left, Reverend Dr. Reese, and so I wanted to invite you to offer any final comments or return to any slides or points that you might want to spend some more time on before we close out our time together.
Thank you, Emily. I appreciate you're all offering these very thoughtful questions, and just to me there's a lot of care going on in your congregations and in your own hearts about how do we move this forward. I want to encourage each of you to tell people at your church and also people in your personal life that you've attended this webinar, because it's going to broaden the resources. You'll of course meet some resistance and people who don't want to know about it, but you never know how you're going to end up meeting someone or engaging in a conversation where you will end up being an agent of God's healing power with that particular person and that particular person's life, or where that person is going to become a healing partner with you and an advocate to move the agenda forward at your congregation. And also just invite you to ask yourself and others in your church, what's our next step here at this church? You might already have a policy and procedures document from a way back, a number of years ago. The high bar has been raised in terms of excellence and comprehensiveness in policies and procedures in the past few years. And so it's always important for congregations to continue to evaluate the document and the policy and procedures as far as how they are working, and are we at the high bar of excellence and comprehensiveness, or is this just gathering dust and was fine in 1995 but doesn't have anything to do with what's the standard of practice now in 2013. And I also just want to say thank you all for contributing to this webinar and being part of our time together today to talk about this very important subject. And know that Faith Trust Institute is here as a resource for you so that you are not alone as you move this forward in your congregations.
Thank you so much, Sarah. In our short hour, we really appreciate you moving us along the path towards using these tools and resources in all of our communities. And we hope that it's been helpful for all of you online with us today for the live session, and also to those of you who may be accessing the recording at a later date. I just want to remind everyone that I will be emailing the slides as a PDF to you later this afternoon, so you can keep an eye out for that. And I will add the additional resources that came up during the presentation. I also want to take a moment to once again thank the Lutheran Community Foundation for sponsoring this webinar as part of their Ending Family Violence Initiative. Their website is thelcf.org, and you can read more about them there. When you close the webinar today, you'll be prompted to fill out a short survey, and that there is a good place to let us know about your experience today and any ideas or hopes that you have for future webinars from us. You can visit our website anytime, faithtrustinstitute.org, and that's where you can find a list of upcoming webinars as well as in-person and online trainings, which we hope you can join us for. So this concludes today's presentation. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again soon. Take care.